Marcus had no idea that the dying man he was about to save held the keys to everything he'd ever dreamed of. At 17, he had already learned that the world had a way of forgetting people like him. People who aged out of the foster system with nothing but a worn backpack and the kind of street wisdom that comes from sleeping with one eye open. The abandoned warehouse on Elm Street had become his sanctuary, if you could call 4 crumbling walls and a leaky roof a sanctuary. Most nights, he'd curl up on a pile of old newspapers, using his jacket as a blanket, listening to the rats scurrying through the walls. The sound had terrified him at first, but now it was almost comforting. At least the rats were consistent, unlike every foster family who had promised him a future and then quietly passed him along when things got complicated. Every morning, Marcus would wake before dawn and walk the streets looking for work. Odd jobs mostly, moving boxes for shop owners who paid in cash and asked no questions. Cleaning parking lots for restaurant managers who needed someone invisible, someone who wouldn't steal or cause trouble. He had learned to make himself small, forgettable, the kind of person people could look through without seeing. But Marcus saw everything. He noticed the way successful people carried themselves, the confidence in their stride, the way they spoke as if the world owed them something good. He would stand outside the university campus sometimes, watching students his age walk between buildings with backpacks full of textbooks and futures full of possibilities. They had no idea how lucky they were. They had no idea that somewhere across town, a brilliant kid was teaching himself calculus from library books because he believed that knowledge was the only thing no one could take away from him. The cruel irony was that Marcus had always been smarter than most of the kids in his foster homes. Teachers had noticed it early, before the system broke him down into just another case number. But intelligence without opportunity is like having a sports car without gas. It can sit there looking impressive, but it's not going anywhere. What sustained him wasn't hope exactly, but something deeper. A quiet certainty that his story wasn't over yet, that somewhere in the chaos of his circumstances, there was a thread he hadn't pulled yet, a door he hadn't tried to open. He didn't know what form it would take, but he knew it was coming. Maybe that's what kept him honest when he could have stolen. Maybe that's what kept him kind when the world had given him every reason to be bitter. The system had failed Marcus in the most bureaucratic way possible. On his 18th birthday, his caseworker handed him a manila envelope containing his birth certificate, a congratulations card from the state, and exactly $200 in cash. "Good luck out there," she had said, already looking past him to the next file on her desk. 18 years of bouncing between homes, and this was his graduation ceremony. Foster care had taught him that love always came with conditions. The Hendersons kept him for 2 years, until their biological son came home from military school and needed his room back. The Patels were kind but overwhelmed, juggling 4 other foster kids and their own financial struggles. Mrs. Rodriguez genuinely cared, but her husband made it clear that Marcus was temporary, a paycheck, nothing more. Each placement ended the same way, a social worker explaining that it was time to move on, that someone else needed the space, that this was just how the system worked. Now, 3 months after aging out, Marcus had created his own routine in the margins of society. He would wake at 5:30 before the sun painted the warehouse walls orange and walk 2 miles to the community center for a shower. The attendant, Mrs. Kim, pretended not to notice that he came every single day, that he carried soap and shampoo in a plastic bag, like someone who didn't have a home to keep them in. After cleaning up, he'd spend hours at the public library, not just for the warmth, but for the knowledge. He had worked his way through advanced mathematics textbooks, computer programming guides, philosophy books that made him question everything he thought he knew about justice and fairness. The librarians had stopped asking for his address when he applied for a card. They saw something in his eyes, the hunger of someone who understood that education was survival, but intelligence without credentials meant nothing to the world. Last Tuesday, he had walked into Davidson Electronics, hoping to convince the manager that his self-taught programming skills were worth a chance. The receptionist barely looked up from her magazine. "Do you have a college degree?" she asked in a tone that already knew the answer. "Do you have any professional references?" Marcus stood there for a moment, realizing that sleeping in foster homes and teaching yourself calculus didn't translate into the language employers understood. The rejection stung, not because it was unexpected, but because it was so casual. He wasn't even worth the courtesy of a real conversation. Walking out of that office, Marcus felt the familiar weight of invisibility settling around his shoulders. But instead of bitterness, he felt something sharper: determination. The world might not see his value yet, but that didn't mean it wasn't there. That Thursday afternoon, Marcus found himself walking through Riverside Heights, the kind of neighborhood where the sidewalks were actually clean and the streetlights worked. He didn't belong here, and everyone seemed to know it. A jogger in expensive athletic wear gave him a wide berth. A woman walking her designer dog clutched her purse a little tighter as he passed. But Marcus had learned that sometimes the best odd jobs came from places where people had money to spend on problems they didn't want to solve themselves. He was 3 blocks from the main commercial strip when he heard the sound that changes everything: the heavy thud of a body hitting concrete. Across the street, an elderly man in a charcoal wool coat had collapsed on the sidewalk outside a coffee shop. His briefcase had spilled open, papers scattering in the afternoon wind like confetti celebrating nothing. The response was immediate and predictable. People stopped, formed a loose circle, and waited for someone else to act. A business executive pulled out his phone, not to call for help, but to check if he was running late for his next meeting. 2 college students whispered to each other about whether they should do something. A barista from the coffee shop stood in the doorway, paralyzed by the liability of getting involved. Marcus didn't hesitate. While everyone else calculated risks and assumed responsibility belonged to someone else, he was already running across the street. The man's face was gray, his breathing shallow and irregular. His eyes were open but unfocused, staring at something beyond the clouds. "Sir, can you hear me?" Marcus dropped to his knees, ignoring the expensive fabric of the man's coat, ignoring the crowd that had gathered to watch but not participate. He pressed 2 fingers against the man's neck, feeling for a pulse. Weak, irregular, fading. The CPR training he'd received in foster care kicked in, muscle memory taking over where panic might have paralyzed someone else. "Call 911!" he shouted to the crowd, but nobody moved. They just stared, phones in their hands like decorative objects. Marcus pulled out his own battered phone and dialed with one hand while starting chest compressions with the other. "I need an ambulance at the corner of Riverside and Oak," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "Elderly male, possible heart attack, unconscious but breathing." The dispatcher's questions came rapid fire, but Marcus answered each one while maintaining the rhythm of compressions that might be the only thing keeping the stranger alive. The ambulance arrived 7 minutes later. 7 minutes of Marcus breathing life into a man whose name he didn't know, whose story was a complete mystery. As the paramedics took over, the old man's eyes found Marcus's for just a moment. There was something there, a flicker of recognition, not of his face, but of his character. The old man survived, but it took the hospital 3 days to figure out who he was. When the paramedics had arrived, his wallet was missing, probably scattered when his briefcase hit the pavement. No identification, no emergency contacts, just an expensive watch and clothes that suggested wealth but revealed nothing concrete. The nursing staff had started calling him John Doe, another nameless patient in a system designed to process rather than truly see people. It wasn't until his personal assistant finally tracked him down through security footage that the truth emerged. The man Marcus had saved was Dr. William Chen, founder of Chen Technologies, a company that had revolutionized mobile computing in the early 2000s before he sold it for $8 billion. For the past decade, he had dedicated his life to philanthropy, quietly funding education initiatives and mentorship programs across the country. But Dr. Chen's wealth had become his burden. His adult children called only when they needed money. His social circle consisted of people who saw dollar signs before they saw him as a human being. He had spent years searching for someone to mentor, someone to eventually carry on his mission of creating opportunities for young people who had been forgotten by the system. Every candidate had disappointed him. They were either already privileged kids from good families who didn't understand struggle, or they were opportunists who saw him as a meal ticket rather than a teacher. The irony wasn't lost on him that he had collapsed in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city, surrounded by people who could afford to help, but chose not to, only to be saved by someone who had nothing, but gave everything anyway. When Dr. Chen learned that his rescuer was a 17-year-old living on the streets, something clicked into place. This wasn't coincidence. This was the universe presenting him with exactly what he had been looking for. From his hospital bed, Dr. Chen made a decision that would change 2 lives forever. He asked his assistant to find Marcus, not to reward him with money, but to observe him, to understand his character, to see if the courage he had shown on the sidewalk was real or just a moment of adrenaline-fueled heroics. The test was about to begin, but this time, it would determine much more than just one person's future. 2 weeks later, Marcus encountered a man who introduced himself simply as Bill. He was waiting outside the library when Marcus emerged with his usual stack of borrowed books, dressed in ordinary clothes that could have come from any department store. Bill claimed to be a small business owner who needed help with some manual labor, offering to pay cash for a few hours of work. There was something familiar about his eyes, but Marcus couldn't place it. "I've got a storage unit that needs organizing," Bill explained, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that comes from years of making decisions. "Nothing too complicated, just sorting through old files and equipment. You interested?" Marcus was always interested in honest work. What he didn't know was that Bill had spent the past 2 weeks learning everything about him. Where he slept, how he spent his days, the way he interacted with the few people who acknowledged his existence. This wasn't surveillance in a sinister sense, but the careful observation of someone who had been burned too many times by people who presented false versions of themselves. The storage unit turned out to be filled with computers, some old, some relatively new, all apparently destined for donation. As they worked, Bill would casually drop tests into their conversations. He left a $20 bill on the workbench and walked away. Marcus immediately called him back, pointing to the money he had forgotten. Later, Bill mentioned that he was short on the cash he had promised to pay Marcus, wondering if they could settle up the next day instead. Marcus simply said that was fine, that he trusted him, even though $20 represented 2 days of food. But the real test came when they finished for the day. As they were loading the last box into Bill's truck, they witnessed a commotion in the parking lot. An elderly woman was arguing with a tow truck driver who was preparing to hook up her beaten-down sedan. She was explaining through tears that she was waiting for her grandson to bring her the money for the parking fine, that she just needed 15 more minutes. Bill watched Marcus carefully, curious to see what he would do. Without hesitation, Marcus approached the woman and quietly handed her $40, nearly everything he had earned that day. "This should cover it," he said gently, ignoring her protests that she couldn't accept charity from a stranger. As they drove away, Bill asked why he had done that. Marcus was quiet for a moment, staring out the window at the city that had never given him much reason to be generous. "My foster mom used to say that dignity is the only thing that costs nothing to give, and everything to lose. He finally said, "That lady wasn't asking for a handout. She was asking for time. I just bought her some." Bill nodded slowly, but inside, his heart was racing. After years of searching, after countless disappointments with people who talked about character, but never demonstrated it when it mattered, he had found what he was looking for. Marcus didn't just have potential. He had something much rarer. He had the kind of moral compass that couldn't be taught or faked, the kind that only develops in people who understand what it means to need help and choose to give it anyway. The revelation was coming soon. But first, Bill needed to be absolutely certain. One more test, and then everything would change. The revelation came on a quiet Sunday morning at the same coffee shop where Dr. Chen had collapsed 3 weeks earlier. Marcus had agreed to meet Bill for what he thought was another day of odd jobs, but instead found himself sitting across from a man whose entire demeanor had shifted. Gone was the casual, small business owner persona. In its place sat someone who carried the weight of real authority, real responsibility. "Marcus," Bill said, his voice steady but charged with emotion, "I need to tell you who I really am." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card, placing it carefully on the table between them. "My name is Dr. William Chen. I'm the founder of Chen Technologies, and you saved my life." Marcus stared at the card, the words not quite registering. The name was familiar from news articles he'd read about tech philanthropy, from business magazines he'd flipped through at the library. But the connection felt impossible, like trying to fit puzzle pieces from different boxes together. "I've been watching you," Dr. Chen continued. "Not to invade your privacy, but to understand who you really are. What I discovered is that you have something I've been searching for my entire adult life. You have character that can't be bought or taught or faked." He leaned forward, his eyes intense but kind. "I want to offer you something, but it's not what you might think. I'm not offering you money. I'm offering you a future." The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Marcus felt his chest tighten, not from fear, but from the sudden vertigo of possibility. "I don't understand," he whispered. "Full scholarship to any university you choose," Dr. Chen said quietly. "Mentorship through your education and beyond. An internship at any company in my network. And when you're ready, the resources to build something of your own, something that matters." He paused, letting the magnitude settle. "I'm not looking for gratitude, Marcus. I'm looking for a partner in changing the world." Marcus's hands trembled slightly as he picked up the business card. His vision blurred, not from confusion, but from tears he had been holding back for months, maybe years. "Why me?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Because," Dr. Chen smiled, "when everyone else walked by, you stopped. When you had nothing, you gave everything. That's not luck, son. That's character. And character is the foundation everything else is built on." For the first time since aging out of foster care, Marcus felt something he had almost forgotten existed: hope with a foundation under it. 5 years later, Marcus Chen Rodriguez stood before a graduating class of 43 former foster youth, each one wearing a cap and gown they had earned through the Marcus Foundation for Forgotten Futures. The name on his diploma now included Chen as an adoptive surname, a gesture Dr. Chen had offered not out of obligation, but out of genuine love for the young man who had become like a son to him. The warehouse on Elm Street had been demolished and replaced with a residential facility that looked nothing like the sterile group homes Marcus remembered from his own childhood. This place had warm lighting, comfortable furniture, and most importantly, mentors who understood that aging out of foster care didn't have to mean aging out of hope. Each graduate represented a chain reaction that started with a single moment of CPR on a sidewalk. Maria, who had been living in her car, was now heading to medical school. James, who had dropped out of high school at 16, held acceptance letters from 3 engineering programs. Sarah had already launched a nonprofit focused on homelessness prevention. Dr. Chen, now in his 70s, watched from the front row with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had learned that the best investments aren't measured in stock prices, but in human potential multiplied. The $8 billion from selling his company had been impressive, but this room full of young adults who refused to let circumstances define their futures was his true legacy. Marcus stepped to the podium, his voice carrying the authority that comes from turning pain into purpose. 5 years ago, I learned that one act of kindness can change everything, he said, looking out at faces that reflected his own journey. But what I'm still learning is that kindness isn't a single act. It's a decision we make every single day to see potential where others see problems. The ripple effect continues, spreading outward in ways that can't be measured or tracked, proving that sometimes the most powerful transformations begin with the simple choice to stop when everyone else walks by. You never know whose life hangs in the balance of your next choice to act or walk by. Every day presents you with moments where kindness costs nothing but could change everything. The Marcus in your neighborhood might be waiting for someone who sees their potential instead of their circumstances. If stories like this remind you that ordinary people create extraordinary change, subscribe and join a community that believes your compassion matters more than you realize.